I am a 24-year-old male moved out of my old apartment 3 months ago and into a house that my father left for me. My father passed away around 6 months back from a cardiac arrest at the age of 47, and I inherited the house he used to live in. It's in a nice neighborhood and is much more spacious than my old apartment, so as soon as my lease was up, I decided to move in. It's a convenient distance from my workplace as well, so it's just perfect for me. I've been living here for close to 3 months, like I mentioned earlier, and about 6 weeks ago my mother, who is a 46-year-old female, reached out to me to ask if she and her family could move in with me for a while. I said yes because she told me that she was almost on the verge of being homeless and needed a place to stay immediately. They'd been living in a motel for 2 weeks, but unfortunately they couldn't continue living there because they were running low on cash. So I agreed to let them move in with me for a little while until their problems were sorted out. Her husband had lost his job due to downsizing, where he and several other employees were laid off without any notice about a month ago, and my mother's a stay-at-home mom, so they didn't have much set aside for emergencies like these. They weren't able to pay their rent on time, and so they were asked to vacate the house they'd been living in. So now my mother, her husband, and 2 kids were all living with me. My current house has 3 bedrooms, so I was okay with giving up the other 2, one for my mother and her husband, and the other for the kids. One is a 12-year-old female, and the other is a 10-year-old male. My parents got divorced when I was 8 years old. They just weren't compatible and would fight all the time about petty things, so eventually they decided that it would be better for them to part ways. The only reason they'd even married each other so young was because my mother was pregnant with me, and there was a lot of pressure from their families to get married before bringing me into the world. So they did exactly that. But they were young and didn't really want to be together, which is why once I was at a reasonable age they got divorced and had joint custody of me. So I'd alternate between living with my mom and then with my dad through the year, and I had a good relationship with both of them growing up. That's part of the reason why I didn't think twice before helping my mother out and letting her move in with me when she was in trouble. But I do regret it now. My parents hadn't stayed in touch over the years, as far as I know. They just had very different personalities that clashed a lot of the time, and I knew for a fact that they couldn't stand each other because of how stiff and awkward they were whenever they spoke to each other, or whenever they'd meet at my school events. Once I turned 18, they didn't need to co-parent me anymore and stopped speaking to each other altogether. By then my mother had also remarried and even had 2 kids. She got married 3 years after her divorce to her current husband, and then had my half-siblings with him. The age gap between me and my half-siblings was huge, so I wasn't particularly close to them growing up because I couldn't really play or have fun with them, which is what kids at my age want. I mean, I must have been 12 at the time my mother's eldest daughter was born, and at that age, a newborn baby wasn't very interesting to me. I was never very close to my mother's husband either, and didn't even refer to him as my stepdad. I'd call him by name because even thinking of him as my father when I already had such a wonderful dad felt weird and wrong. So no, I'm not very close to my mother's family, and the only reason I let them move in at all was for my mother's sake. My father never remarried or had other kids, and whenever I was not living with him, he'd be either working or traveling because that's what he loved. My mother didn't know that my dad had left this house to me, and after she'd moved in, she was quite impressed that I'd been able to afford such a nice house at my age, so I ended up telling her at the time that this was actually what I'd inherited from my father. She'd known that her ex-husband had passed away and had even attended the funeral, but she hadn't bothered to ask about my inheritance, so I'd never told her either, because it had honestly just slipped my mind. And when I did tell her, I'd told her about it quite conversationally and didn't think much of it. Even she didn't have much of a reaction, so there was literally no way I could have foreseen what was about to come. My mother and her family had been living here for a little over a month, and I'd been getting kind of agitated because they showed no signs of moving out anytime soon and had made themselves quiet at home. Her husband insisted that he was looking for a new job, but also kept saying that we were in a recession right now, so things would take time, and promised that they'd be out of my hair as soon as he found another job. I tried not to bring it up often, but was finding it difficult because ever since I'd turned 18, I'd gotten very used to living by myself and having the house to myself. So this was a bit of an inconvenience for me, but I tried my best not to make them feel bad about it. But then, last week, my mother sat me down after the kids had gone to sleep and told me that she and her husband had something important to tell me. I thought that they finally had some good news to share, but instead, she informed me that she'd spoken to a lawyer, and she'd decided to contest my father's will, and so I had to vacate this house because she believed that this property was rightfully hers. And why did she believe that? Just because she'd supported my dad in the early days of his career by sacrificing her own so that she could raise me and tend to the house while he went out to work? So she felt like she was owed this house, and since she hadn't asked for much in the divorce settlement, she thought that this would be a befitting repayment for that. She'd already filed the petition to contest the will and told me that I'd be served in a few days, but she still wanted to give me a heads up so that I wouldn't be blindsided and advised me to start looking for a new home. I was livid when she told me what she'd done because I'd been helping her out for the past 6 weeks by letting her stay here, and this was how she repaid me? By trying to get me kicked out of my own house? I literally had no idea how to react to this, and my first instinct was to panic, because there was a very real chance that I'd lose this house to my mother, and I didn't want that because I'd grown attached to it. It reminded me of Dad because sometimes I'd visit him here, and those were some good times that we had. He'd only purchased this house recently, 3 or 4 years back, and it was in beautiful condition, and it was just the perfect fit for me. So I really didn't want my mother to take it away. At that point I told her that I wasn't going anywhere and that I'd make sure that she's the one who's evicted soon enough, so she'd better start looking for a place to live. Then I stormed off to my room and slammed the door shut so that I could call my dad's lawyer to talk to him about this. He'd dealt with the divorce and he'd dealt with the will too, so I knew that he'd have all the answers as to whether my mother could actually do this to me or not. My dad's lawyer informed me on the phone that her claim of not asking for much in the divorce settlement was completely untrue, as she had received almost $80,000 in the settlement and in alimony payments. So that's a lot, and definitely not much as my mother had been claiming, but she could definitely try to claim this house and contest my dad's will, but his lawyer reassured me that it was unlikely she'd stand a chance in court, since she hadn't spoken to my dad or kept in touch with him after the divorce, and had even remained and had kids with another man. So her claim would probably be dismissed almost immediately. I had nothing to worry about legally, so that was a relief. But I was still really angry that my mother had decided to pull a fast one on me just because I'd been kind enough to support her and her family. I was being kind. I'm not stupid. The very next morning, before the kids had woken up, I decided to talk to my mother and inform her that she couldn't live here anymore. It was early, too, probably like 5 or 6 in the morning, and she was very taken aback as well as disoriented when I woke her up. Told her to pack up and get the hell out of my house, or else I'd call the cops and have them escorted out instead, and that wouldn't be pretty for any of them. She argued with me, saying that this house was as much hers as it was mine, and in a few weeks it'd be completely hers, which was hilarious, but I wasn't going to let her intimidate me. So I told her that time would tell if that was true or not, but for now, this house was completely and entirely mine, and she had 0 rights over it, so she needed to leave or I would make her leave. She thought I was bluffing, and so did her husband, so they pushed me out of the room and locked themselves inside and refused to leave, and then I did exactly what I'd promised. I called the police and reported them for trespassing and had them legally removed from my property. I felt bad for the kids, but honestly, I'd had enough of my mother and her husband and I just couldn't take it anymore. Once the cops were there, they tried to reason with me and begged me to let them stay, but it was too little too late. I'd already seen their true colors, and I wasn't going to let them stick around and make things worse, so they absolutely had to leave, and they had to leave now. My mother was cursing at me even as she packed some of her clothes and her kids' stuff, but it wasn't going to change my mind now. Thankfully, they'd only brought clothes with them and no furniture, and had been sleeping on foldables, so they were done quickly enough, and soon enough they were all gone, and I was back to being on my own again. But ever since that incident, my mother has been texting me every single day to convince me to take them back in, and has even stopped the proceedings to contest the will to avoid any further complications. I've managed to ignore her for a while, but last night she told me that they're really low on money and can't afford to live at a motel anymore. They're desperately in need of a place to live and asked me to take them back in just for the sake of their kids. So I told her that I'd be willing to take the kids in, but she and her husband cannot come back here. She flipped out on me and called me heartless and cruel and said that I deserved to go to hell for how I'm treating them, and then disconnected the call. Am I the a-hole for saying no to letting my mother and her husband live at my place, even though they might become homeless otherwise? Update 1. Thank you everybody for all the advice and reassurance. That helped me compose myself since I'd been feeling very guilty about not letting my mother stay with me. I felt really terrible for my half-siblings, but if my mother didn't want to let them live with me, then there was very little that I could do for them. I haven't heard from my mother or her husband since that last phone call, and I'm concerned that they're probably homeless right now, which is just really sad for them. But they honestly brought this onto themselves. I can't imagine how or why my mother felt entitled enough to demand that I vacate my own house and look for someplace else to live. She'd never had anything nice to say about my dad after they separated, and hardly even spoke to him back when he was alive. So to say that she felt that he owed her this house was an insane statement to make, and she even decided to act on it and contest the will. Likely, my mother had just assumed that she would inform me that she wanted the house and was contesting the will, and I would just transfer the ownership to her without questioning anything simply because she felt that my dad owed her that house. She was my mother, and I would have loved to help her out and support her at a time when she seemed to really need it, just like she'd done for me throughout my childhood. But I wasn't going to do that at the cost of myself. And like I said, her husband had just become lazy after I allowed them to move in, and would promise us that he was looking for work, but I never saw him do anything other than smoke on the couch and watch television, as if he could afford to just sit back and relax like nobody's business. I didn't say anything to him, but I kept asking my mother to speak to him and get him to put himself out there, because they obviously couldn't just stay here for the rest of their lives, but even she kept putting it off and said that it'd happen whenever it was destined to. They were just too laid back, and if that's the way they'd been living their lives, then it was hardly surprising that they were in such a dire situation today. I just feel bad for the kids because this is not their fault, and yet they're suffering even more than their parents are. It's been close to 4 days since I last spoke to my mother, but I'm hoping that she found someplace else to live, because otherwise it's just going to keep bothering me. She's not a very nice human being, but she's still my mother, and I would want for her and her kids to be safe and sound. I'm still not going to let her move back in here, though, not after how she tried to screw me over, even though I was trying to support her. She can send the kids over and hire someone to watch over them, but that's the most I'm willing to do for her, simply out of humanity and nothing else. Now the ball is in her court. If she wants my help for her kids, she can contact me, and if not, then that's her call and I'll respect it. Update 2. Hey, so quick update, my mother still hasn't called me or reached out to me, and I'd sort of forgotten about her as well because it's been 2 whole weeks since we last spoke. A few hours ago, my mother's husband called me up and asked me if I'd be willing to lend him some money for the time being. I wasn't going to just hand over the money without first making sure that he wasn't up to something shady, so I asked him why he needed it, and he told me that he'd decided to take his kids and my mother and take the next bus to go visit his brother who lived a little out of town. He needed the money for bus tickets and told me that he'd return it as soon as he'd be able to. I don't believe he's going to return the money. Just like he's never going to cover his share of the electricity bills from when their family lived with me, but it's fine. I'm not the kind of person to hold on to grudges, and I believe in helping people in their time of need, so I agreed to lend him the money. I have more than what I need for myself by God's grace, and lending some money to my mother to help her out wasn't going to make me poor. Her husband also asked me to visit them at the motel one last time because even though my mother wouldn't be willing to admit it, she really does want to see me one last time before she moves out of the city. She hasn't called me herself, but I'm still going to visit her to say goodbye. She can choose to continue being pissed at me for what happened, but I'm not sorry in the slightest for what I did. And I'm still the only person helping them out right now, so I'm going to expect her to be grateful for it. Update 3. Hey guys, so I'm back home after an intensely emotional meeting with my mother. I'd sent the money that they needed for the commute to her brother-in-law's place and a little extra to her husband a few minutes before I entered the motel. Her husband looked grim and didn't speak much, but led me to the motel room and took the kids down to the lobby with him so that my mother and I could talk without being interrupted. At first, she was very brusque with me and thanked me for helping them out with the money in spite of whatever had happened, and I thought this was going to be it, so I just said welcome and was about to leave. But she stopped me and told me that she was also really apologetic for trying to screw me over and get me kicked out of my own house. She admitted that she'd been really stupid to try that anyway, since she knew that she didn't actually deserve that house, and neither did my dad owe it to her. But she was just desperate for her kids to have a proper home, which is why she did what she did. I'm glad she came around and realized that what she'd done was messed up. But I also told her that this was the last time I was helping them out, and told them not to make a habit out of it. She agreed and informed me that in a day or two they'd be taking the bus so that they could move in with her husband's brother who had a poultry farm. It wasn't the most glamorous job, which is why her husband had been reluctant to join him, but now this was the only option they had. Her kids were a little upset about leaving their friends behind, and I could understand that it must be tough for them already, but what can you say? That's life. She said that she's grateful that her brother-in-law was kind enough to take them in and let her husband join the business. She finally had some hope for the future, so that's good for her and her family. She's given me the address of the place as well and told me to visit if I ever wanted to, but didn't pressure me into it, given what had happened in the recent past. It's just been 3 weeks since I had them kicked out, but it already feels like an eternity has passed since then. Sadly, she and her family have to go through so much, and given that she's almost 50, it's definitely not easy for her to deal with this devastating situation. Add to that 2 young kids to take care of and think about. They're not even in their teens yet and are already watching their parents struggle with money and eviction. They're just too young for this. If I'm being very honest, I know this decision of mine to lend my mother money, despite what she tried to do a few weeks back, will draw a lot of flack from people, and you guys might even think of me as weak-willed and a soft target. But I mostly did it out of pity for the kids. I didn't feel very connected to them when they were born because I was so young myself, but now that I'm a lot older, things have changed. And I lived with those 2 kids for a month. I know them personally now, and they're bright and happy. They certainly deserve better. My mother messed up big time, and I already evicted her for it, but beyond that, I don't have it in me to turn my back on people who need my help. Even my mother's husband, lazy as he is, doesn't deserve to go through something like this. He used to be quite respectable earlier, and I'd never even imagined that a day would come when he'd be asking me for financial help. It's pathetic, and I just would never have been able to live with myself if I'd refused to support them in their time of need. Not just because this is my mother's family, but because there are human beings first. I couldn't let those 2 kids go into foster care. I just couldn't let that happen, but neither could I adopt them yet. So I did what was best for everyone. At least now I'll be able to go to sleep knowing that I did the right thing. And that's what matters to me the most, to be honest. Update 4. My mother just texted me and told me that they've moved in with her brother-in-law and are trying to settle themselves now. It's difficult to deal with the change so suddenly, but they're making the best of the situation. The kids are alternating between missing their friends and talking about going back and chasing after the chickens, just like kids do. It's nice to know that they're getting a fresh start, and I'm the one who made it possible. Feels like I put my money to some good use finally. Things are still tense between my mother and I, and we don't speak for more than 2 to 3 minutes at a stretch, and keep our conversations restricted to talking about how she's doing now and how the kids are coping and my work, just safe topics. Maybe we'll be able to fix things someday, and maybe we won't, but for now this is what it is, and I'm okay with it. It's been almost a week since they moved out of the city now, so let's see what the future holds.